Hello, welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. So, as I mentioned in a previous video, for the month of September, I am reading nothing but vampire stories and books and watching a lot of vampire movies. Well, I just finished the first book on my list, and I'm not really doing like a TBR. Just I gathered up a bunch of different vampire books, so I'm just going to read them at random. But the first one I read, and it was really good, is called Children of the Night by Dan Simmons. I found this copy a couple weeks ago during one of my hauls, and I was really thrilled to get it. I only read one other book by Dan Simmons, and that's Hyperion, the science fiction classic. Just the first one. I know there's a whole series, and that book is really good. And I do want to read all of those books at some point. So I knew he was a really good writer. And this was very good. It really kind of puts a unique spin on the Dracula story. So the story takes place in the 90s in Romania after the revolution against the dictatorship of Ceausescu, I think is how it's pronounced. And during his regime, he had outlawed birth control and abortion. So there were, as a result, there are a whole bunch of orphaned children living in these really deplorable conditions. A lot of them had AIDS. So this was all true events that take place in this book, which is interesting because it creates this very realistic world coupled with this fantasy world of Dracula. So you really feel like Dracula exists when you read it in this kind of setting. I could tell that Dan Simmons, he's a very intellectual writer. I could tell he really did his research, and I read in the afterword that he had, visited Romania. So he paints a very grim picture of that country at that time. Now, hopefully, it's not like that now. But there's still the shadow of the secret police and all of the kind of that world that disastrous world after all of these events took place, and there was a war and like fighting in the streets and bloodshed and this type of thing. So that the lingering shadow of those events is kind of part of this story's milieu, and it's beautifully rendered. So you have this contrast between this leftover kind of communist industrial world with this wildness of the Dracula story in the Carpathian Mountains with the wolves and the craggy mountains and the inaccessible roads and the people like still kind of living in like this very kind of agrarian farmland. It's basically about this American doctor named Kate who comes there to do, she's a hematologist, so she is doing some research, and she visits one of the orphanages and ends up adopting one of the sick babies named Joshua. She brings him back to the States, and then these strange characters who are vampires descend on her household and steal the baby back and bring him back to Romania because this is a very special child, which I won't give away. So she goes back to Romania with this priest named O'Rourke, who's there. She meets him in the beginning in Bucharest, I think it was, and he's on some like mission, and they have a very interesting relationship. He is a former Vietnam vet who had lost his leg in the war, and they strike up this very intense, shall I say, relationship, and together they fight the vampires to get the child back. So it's like that kind of story. It's like a road story. It's an adventure. It's like a lot of action. And then there's also part of the story, which I almost wish there had been more of in this book. I would say that was like the only thing. Well, there are a couple of things that I found it a little bit disappointing. Is that part of the story is in Vlad the Impaler's, Vlad Dracula, and it gets into like the Order of the Dragon and the Vlad the Impaler's, his story. And it goes all the way back to like the 1400s. And in a first person narrative, he's describing all the horrible things that he's done in torturing people and impaling people and all these things that he was known for. In the afterword, Dan Simmons also references some books about, which I am now really curious about the true Vlad and all that history. And then also ends up in this very dramatic climax at Dracula's real castle. So it's a very interesting combination of true historical events with this vampire myths and how it all kind of fits together. It's also like a medical thriller. And I guess maybe that was another part that I found because I barely passed biology in high school. There's a lot of medical jargon that I found a little bit tedious, but and I also didn't know like how much of this is real. Like, is this really like I mean, obviously the vampire stuff was a bit of a stretch, but it seemed very feasible and very plausible. A lot of the medical jargon, and it sort of breaks down like the viruses and the blood diseases and this kind of thing. He goes into a lot of detail about that, which some readers might find that like super interesting. I found it a little bit like, let's get back to let's get back to Dracula kind of thing. But overall, I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's really good. Dan Simmons is a great writer, and it is a little more dense than maybe like your typical action adventure story. But I would highly recommend Children of the Night by Dan Simmons. And this was a really nice book to be the first one that I started with my Vampire September. And I'm looking forward to moving on to the next book. So if you want to follow my adventures, check out what's happening on my Instagram page, because I'm kind of doing a poll on like sexiest vampires. And so far, in the men's category anyway, Gary Oldman as Bram Stoker's Dracula is ahead, having beaten out David Bowie from The Hunger. And I watched The Hunger just recently. It was great. And that's the next book that I'm reading. You know, I just feel like I'm going to find a body down here. So let me know if you ever read Children of the Night and what you thought of it. And any other vampire suggestions you might have, please put them in the comments below. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon. Bye.